what I'm going to brief is a report that reflects the commissioning of work over, I would say, a period of 2 years roughly, that I put together, and Tom Cochran agreed to work on a overview, and more important, to get some real numbers associated with how the civil sector might be exploited by the Chinese if they chose to make nuclear weapons, and what the numbers might be, and how to think about that. Now, I should say by way of introduction that this work is part of a larger project, and it has various dimensions, and it roughly is concerned with the verification and enforcement of the NPT, which, you know, is probably the most dispossessed of arms control instruments, I would say. It's almost like biodiversity. Everyone's in favor, but nobody knows what it is, and they don't do much to help it, but they're all in favor of it. So we're trying to put a little bit more edge on that proposition and ask, well, you know, if you're serious about enforcing it, you know, what would that consist of, and what would it require? And in this regard, we got, I should say we, the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center got funding from both, I would say, conservative and left of center charitable foundations, and I think that those include MacArthur and Carnegie, but also Scaife and Smith Richardson. But perhaps most important to me is the contribution and backing that we got from the State Department's Bureau of Arms Control and Verification, and they partially funded this effort as well. So why don't we put up the charts and let the show begin, so to speak.
I just wanted to briefly mention, if you're not speaking, please mute yourself just to reduce the feedback. And if you have any questions or comments, please place them in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I want to emphasize something that, I mean, I love talking, as everyone knows, but I do stop. And when that happens, it's really important that we be able to tap the expertise that's in this audience, which is really quite remarkable. All right, so why don't we get going? Let's go to the first slide. All right, this brief draws on something that has been covered first by Reuters and Tim Gardner, who deserves, I think, a lot of credit for being willing to cover the report when, frankly, nobody else much was interested. However, it kind of picked up a little head of steam more recently. The South China Morning Post, you know, ran something well on the front page, and I always say, if your enemies express an interest in what you're doing, you're making, you know, some progress. I shouldn't say enemies, but certainly, I guess we call them competitors. Yeah. Yesterday, I got a tutorial on the change in how media is working. Al Jazeera ran a story. I can't say that I had anything to do with this story. If anything, I had to correct some of the things in it when it ran, because it got a few things wrong, but they're mostly fixed. Please go to the next slide. All right. Both Ambassador Countryman and Chris Ford are here. I think it's worth noting that both co-authored a preface which essentially endorsed the study's key findings and recommendations. As they point out, they don't write a lot together, and I think that ought to be something for people to think about as we go into this brief. Can you go to slide 4? All right, what are the key questions this brief will cover? First, how do fast reactors differ from thermal reactors, and why are they excellent for making weapons plutonium? The short answer is they run on nuclear weapons explosive plutonium themselves, and they produce even more. It's why many
of the fast reactors we're talking about are called breeder reactors. They breed more fissile than they consume. Second, how many weapons could the PRC acquire by 2030 if it exploited just its fast reactor program with the existing material we believe they have on tap? The short answer that Tom and I developed, I should say mostly Tom, is 1,270 roughly. That's about the number of nuclear weapons we currently have mounted on intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine launched missiles in our force. So that's a pretty interesting number, and we'll get back to that. U.S. estimates of what the Chinese have dialed what the civil sector can do to contribute to the development of a larger arsenal into U.S. official projections. I will have to just say perhaps, but at best and most likely only recently. And that's a polite way of saying I fear not enough and maybe not much at all yet. Next question. A PRC agreed in 97 to report annually to the IAEA on its plutonium holdings and its related activities. This is an agreement that we are voluntarily in, as well as the Russians, as well as the Japanese, as well as the Swiss, as well as the French, as well as the UK, on and on. And the short answer is, do we know why they stopped reporting 3 years ago? The short answer is, to my knowledge, we do not know why. Given the abysmal economics of plutonium-fueled reactors, are there any security or financial downsides to pausing their commercial development? Not only in China, but Japan, South Korea, and even the US? The short answer is no. Okay, let's go through and see if we can give a little more substance to those conclusions.
Henry, there's a question on the 1270. Is that without MARVing or with?
Say again, there's a question?
Yes, is the 1270 on the MARVs, is that with or without on the 1270? Multiple warheads.
There are 1,270 nuclear warheads. Okay. Whether they're placed in families or get divorced or go single, I have no view on. Those are the warheads.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Let's now go to number 5. Okay, can we get to slide number 5? We're on it?
Yep.
All right. Okay, how do they differ from conventional or what are called thermal reactors, fast reactors and thermal ones? And why are fast reactors excellent for making weapons-grade plutonium? Now, I don't know how well you can see this next chart, number 6, but on one side, we have thermal neutron reactions. And essentially, you take a fissile atom of U-235, and that's that blue item at the very top. You see where the word thermoneutron is aimed at the very top. In any case, a neutron that has a certain amount of energy normally will be called a thermal neutron. There are fast neutrons and thermal neutrons. But if a thermal neutron is directed towards an atom of U-235, statistically, it will occasionally make that so unstable that it will break up into fission fragments, usually barium and kryptonium. But in any case, it will then, after it turns into smaller fission fragments, or lighter ones, if you will, than U-235, it will release energy and usually 2 or 3 neutrons. Those neutrons are not going to be thermal. They're going to be fast. They're going to have more energy. Now, in a thermal reactor, which is the kind of reactor that's very popular, light water and heavy water reactors, which make up almost all the population of power reactors we know of in the world, What they do is they moderate the speed or energy, if you will, of the fast neutron so that it becomes thermal in energy again, and then fissions another U-235 to get a chain reaction and release heat in a controlled way. So the thermal neutron reactions are over there to the right. And there is a certain amount of production of plutonium, but it in a thermal reactor, normally you run it long enough that plutonium is generally rendered and transmuted over the time that you want to operate it into what's called reactor grade plutonium, which can be used in weapons, but is not, let's say, optimal for weapons. All right. And I think people exaggerate the difference between the two, but I don't want to get into that debate. What's interesting, however, is the fast neutron reactions. Again, we have our thermal neutron and it produces fast neutrons. But if you have not U-235, but U-238, which is a material that is present in nature 99.7% of the time, it will respond to a fast neutron in a way that U-235 won't. More often than not, a fast neutron may shoot through a U-235 atom, but a U-238 atom will capture it and it will transmute and decay, if you will, or transmute over a pretty short period of time, about 2 days, into weapons grade plutonium or plutonium-239. And fast reactors use that plutonium-239. They cull it out from the spent fuel and use it as fresh fuel. And that's the reason they call it recycling. And that's the reason they call it breeding, because these fast reactors are capable of using the fertile U-238 atoms to produce more fissile on balance than they start with to fuel the reactor. And they can cull that out, keep that reactor running without mining more uranium. I should stop right here because I think there's enough here to confuse almost anybody. Can anybody, does anybody have any questions about what I just explained? And if so, Bailey, can you tell me what the questions are?
So far, there's nothing in the chat.
I scared off all the horses.
Tom
I'm afraid
Cochran. Tom Cochran. Go ahead, Tom.
Tom Cochran may be able to clarify. Go ahead, Tom.
I'll just give my version of what you're trying to say.
Okay.
All reactors, when the fissile material is hit by fissions, you get fast neutrons out. In a thermal reactor, it's designed so that you try to slow those down before they refission to keep the chain reaction going. The real difference that you want to point out between the fast reactors and the thermal reactors is that the fast reactors have blanket material outside of the core where there's not a lot of fissioning going on, but there's a lot of U-238 and it absorbs these excess fast neutrons and produces the plutonium. And the plutonium that's produced is weapon grade over the period of time between the refueling. Whereas in the core of both reactors, both fast and thermal reactors, you're going to have both plutonium-239, 240, 241, and so forth. So the big difference is you have a blanket out there where you can make a lot of weapon grade plutonium.
We'll show that in a moment. So this is helpful. Let's go to the next slide to kind of iterate a bit. Number 7.
Okay.
Now, Tom talked about conventional thermal reactors, heavy water, light water, and a few graphite reactors still out there. What they do is they use a moderator, usually regular water, which is called light water, H2O, heavy water, which has deuterium, and graphite are the most popular moderators. And those fast neutrons that come when you fission a U-235 atom hit that moderator, if you will, and slow down, or and make it more likely that they will fission more uranium U-235 atoms. So the moderator is pretty important to sustaining the reaction. So that's the kind of light water reactors. 3 Mile Island is a famous one. We have some heavy water reactors we're going to talk about maybe later in China. There are some graphite reactors that once were in the UK, but now we see them in North Korea. Those are thermal reactors that use moderators. All right, let's go to slide number 8. Now, Tom talked about axial and radial blankets or blankets. The configuration of a breeder reactor, and fast reactors for that matter, frequently, is that they have a core. It says medium enriched uranium or plutonium core, and then they have a little bit more material at both ends, or at the axis of the rods, and that's called the axial blanket. And then they have a radial blanket that goes around the core. That blanket is made of U-238, and it does absorb the fast neutrons and produces a certain significant percentage of U-239, which is weapons-grade plutonium. So let's now take a look at a few examples of the commercial fast breeder reactors that we know about. In slide number 9, the thing to really keep in mind is that these machines do not produce economically competitive electricity. And we know this all too well by the number that have been shut down, and some of them were shut down, well, most of them actually for technical reasons. They just could not operate. They're dealing with sodium, dealing with the kind of refueling entailed in these machines. They are not generally known for reliability. They're very much more expensive to build than thermal reactors because the sodium itself is quite reactive to anything that has oxygen in it, whether it's air or water, and it explodes. So you have to be really careful. The plutonium itself is very toxic. You have to handle it differently than fresh uranium fuel, on and on. So we have examples where Japan gave up on its breeder reactor program to Manchu. Germany turned theirs into an amusement park at Kalgar. Donray was shut down. There was a commercial effort even, but it went, and almost, there's a book called The Day We Almost Lost Detroit. Well, that's not a joke. There was some near history there that was pretty sporty, and they shut that thing down. In France, they ran 2 machines, and they used them to make nuclear weapons material as well as electricity. But they shut both of theirs down. All right, let's take a look at what's still operating in slide 10. India has been working on theirs for I don't know how long, at least more than a decade or so. Russia has a fast breeder reactor that it's most interested in, but it can't finance. So it's exporting a lot of this technology to help pay for the program to, you guessed it, China. And we have an experimental machine, which is operating, 20 megawatts electrical, and 2 fast breeder reactors of 600 megawatts. Wei Zhang is responsible for letting us know about these things, and I believe he's here tonight. And he also has alerted us to the construction of 2 reprocessing plants, and we'll get to that in a moment, that are necessary to help fuel these machines. So let's go to number 11. There is a lot of reprocessing activity that is potentially or actually underway in East Asia. There is a plant that has been operating roughly, I believe, since 2010 that is relatively small in China, and it can produce 50 bombs worth. This 100 figure I think is way too high, but per year. There is there was discussion of building an enormous 800 ton of heavy metal per year plant that would produce 1,200 to 1,500 bombs worth of plutonium a year from stripping out plutonium from spent thermal reactor fuel is what these things mostly do. And then they feed the material as fresh fuel, part of fresh fuel in the breeder reactor that they're building. That plant with France has not been built, and I don't know that it ever will be. Japan, meanwhile, has been trying to get their plant open for decades. They think they'll do it in 2023. And again, it can go make 1,200 to 1,500 bombs worth of plutonium a year. Remember, that's roughly what we have deployed in our entire strategic force. That's what this thing will produce a year. Now, the two things that Wei Zhang brought to the world's attention were these two plants. The first one is going to come online, if all goes well, by 2025, and it will strip spent fuel from thermal reactors in China and produce plutonium, which will then go into fast breeder reactors, who will then produce more plutonium that will be clearly weapons grade. There's a second plant that just was discovered that Wei Zhang highlighted, and it likely will come online, we don't know, but sometime before 2023. There is a pyro reprocessing plant that the ROK would like to build, and they're doing some experimental work with the United States. This program was in sort of a condition of not being supported, certainly by the South Korean government recently. They didn't really fund it for the coming year. But I noticed that the United States Department of Energy is showing more interest in perhaps working on pyro reprocessing. So there's an election, I believe, next year in South Korea. Who knows what's going to happen there? I only bring this up because there could be something of a competition amongst these parties in producing materials that are nuclear explosives. Let's go to the next slide, number 13.
There's a quick question.
There is.
To
okay.
the Japan one that you mentioned, in terms of the 1,200 bombs estimate, is that not a single stage fission warhead, but a two-stage thermonuclear weapon?
Well, that's just the primaries. Whether or not and if Japan would make boosted weapons that are single stage or would go to thermonuclear devices is something that many people debate. I would only point out that it is conceivable they might. And the reason why is you take a look at the number of fusion institutes that are research institutes in Japan, it's quite a significant number. I mean, you've got to wonder why they're that interested in fusion. Last I checked, fusion for civil uses is about as likely on the current schedule as harnessing energy from moonbeams. It's really quite distant. And so they have all these institutes. Surely they know a lot about thermonuclear reactions as a result. But that said, no, that is just the number for building what we call primaries, which is a fission device that can be used by itself or used in a two-stage device as what they call the primary, if you will, what sets off the secondary, which burns in due course a significant amount of fusion fuel and produces more of its yield from fusion than from fission. Does that answer the question? Did that help?
Mr. Babin, I think you have a follow-on. Do you mind stating it out loud for us? I just want to make sure we get it captured correctly.
Sorry, can you guys hear me? I'm looking at slides on the screen and then by phone listening to the audio. So I guess what I'm kind of driving at here is then when we're talking about warheads, since the Chinese don't actually have any fission weapons in their inventory, we're talking about 600 possible thermonuclear warheads per year from the 800.
Could you slow down and just ask the question? Because please slow down.
Sure, yeah.
And just ask the question.
Sure. So the question was, so what we're really talking about here is 600 potential thermonuclear warheads per year from the Chinese EDF plant that has the 800
I do not know, sir. Sir, no, I don't know why you're asserting that. Primaries do not, they can make thermonuclear, the balance of the secondary, without plutonium. So
sure.
the number of primaries tells you how many thermonuclear weapons they can make, because they have, as we will see, plenty of uranium. And they can make lots of tritium. And for the secondary, that's all you need.
Okay, so we're talking 1,200 primaries.
If you give me a chance, I will get to weapons design, and I think it'll be clear.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's go to number 12. Okay, how many more weapons? Well, let's take a look at slide 13. And this is a cartoon. It's a schematic. This is not a precise vision of what a weapon exactly looks like. But what you have is a fission device that's called the primary. That is the round concentric circle item at the top. And if you want to make it as light as possible and use as little material as possible, the ideal material is to use plutonium. Now, you can use plutonium with uranium and what's called a composite core. You can even use highly enriched uranium simply. But if you want to make it as light as possible, and if you want to make it with the least amount of uncertainty for design considerations and variables, you make it with just plutonium. The secondary, as you can see, does not require plutonium, nor does it require anything more than uranium-238 and lithium-6. All right. So the primaries are the thing, if you will, if you want to make a single stage or a two-stage device. All right. Let's go to 14. All right. Now, we made Tom, I think Tom did a really good job of, keeping us from, going crazy or overboard. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that you can get bigger numbers pretty easily than what we got. We only looked at using plutonium and primaries, not composite cores or highly enriched uranium primaries. If you did, you would get larger numbers than what we got. Okay, but we didn't go that route. We went with what was least burdensome and easiest to do without testing or any concern about design. I'm not sure you need to test. There's a big debate between Tom and myself on that. But let's just say we went with the least controversial, most conservative route. Okay. We assumed a capacity factor of the various reprocessing and fast reactors of 75%. The recycling was only of the radial blanket. We took none of the weapons grade material out of the axial blankets. Try to make it as easy and quick as possible. That, if you did, the number would go up. We also used figures that were available for what we thought would be the amount of material on hand in the way of stockpiled weapons grade plutonium. We'll get to that in a moment. The only public figure really there is the one that you find in the International Panel on Fissile Material. And there's no reason to think that that's the correct number, but it's the best number we got. And so we went with that. And it's interesting, when we went with that number, it seemed to be a number that was sympathetic to the kinds of statements the Pentagon was using. We'll get to that in a moment. You really do want to know why the Pentagon says the number is in the low hundreds currently as the number of nuclear weapons the Chinese have. The reason why is it's a rare day in Tipperary when you find the Federation of American Scientists, SIPRI, and others who are not exactly in the business of being harsh on China, coming up with numbers like 350, not 210 or 220. And yet that is the current situation. People will want to know why. We'll get to that in a moment. And we only considered declared plants. And we used the PRC building schedule. I mean, who knows? I mean, if you want to get crazy, they could have covert plants, but we didn't get into that. All right. Number 15 gives you some idea, moreover, of just how focused they are now on this fast breeder reactor program. This is a pretty ambitious schedule, which they are launched on. They have, they started construction on one plant and finished in 4 years, and it's operating. They're, working on an experimental fast breeder reactor, and that also started up in less than 6 years. Therefore, I think we got to take them seriously with the 4 following plants, the 2 reprocessing plants, the 2 fast reactor plants. I think they're going to get done when they predict. And that means we're going to see the production of weapons-grade plutonium as a peaceful, normal activity from the first breeder reactor in 2023 and the second one in 2026. Okay, let's go to slide 17. Have the estimates dialed in to PRC's possible exploitation of its civil sector? I think the answer is unclear, and let's go to slide 18. And this is some testimony by Admiral Richard, who is the head of Stratcom, and he's answering a question by Senator Mike Rounds. Why don't we play that and see what you think of the answer and how it probably answers our question.
Can you talk a little bit about what China's civilian nuclear production capabilities are and whether or not we're factoring that in with regard to their ability to produce nuclear material and the number of warheads that they're capable of producing in a very short period of time? And I guess what I'm thinking about are the fast reactors that they have available to them right now.
Senator, that is actually a great example of how rapidly China is changing, or at least how rapidly we're figuring it out, right? So the answer to your question is yes, but that is only as of about a week ago that we became aware of that and started the process to understand the implications of that. Obviously, with a fast breeder reactor, you now have a very large source of weapons-grade plutonium available to you. That will change the upper bounds of what China could choose to do if they wanted to in terms of further expansion of their nuclear capabilities. We haven't yet run all the numbers. You're right, the answers would have to come back in closed session, but it's only been within the last week that we became aware that this limitation on them has changed in an upward direction.
Okay, now I cannot prove this, but I can tell you that I shared a copy of the NPEC report with about as senior an official in the DIA as you can imagine. I'll leave it at that. And that was about 2.5 weeks before we got this testimony. He told me that he had given it to at least this command and at least 1 or 2 others. So, I mean, I don't want to say I know that this is what this is about, but there's a good chance. I don't know that you could ever get them ever to say that. But I don't think it matters. I think what matters isn't whether NPEC was responsible for this or not. I think him saying twice, we only began to look at this a week ago, is a bit worrisome, folks. I mean, that is not, you do not want NPEC thinking that it's causing them to think about this. You want them to be thinking about it, and you want them not to be thinking about it a week ago. Now, it may very well be that there's much more to this story, but we'll get to that in recommendations. You want to find out, that is for sure. 19. Okay, now China agreed in 1997 to report annually to the IAEA on its plutonium holdings and its related activities. We agreed to this. Well, actually, go to the next slide, 20. Those are all the countries that agreed in 1997 to do likewise. The United States, UK, France, Belgium, Switzerland, Japan, Russia, Germany. Well, here's the thing. You can go to the website, and every year you can see who's complied. You can't get the actual report, but you can find out who reported. In 2017, you could see that was the last report. To my knowledge, no one has asked why they stopped. All right, let's go to slide 21. Okay, given the abysmal economics of plutonium-fueled reactors, are there any security or financial downsides to pausing their commercial development? I emphasize commercial development. I think everyone has entitled to their opinion, apparently, on these matters. Apparently, what's economic is like alternative facts. Anybody can come up with anything they want. But I think if you go to slide 22, it is worth noting how many people on the right and left have endorsed the idea of a pause because they don't think there are any downsides, and they think there may be upsides. Now, they may think they're different. The groups may have different views as to what the upsides are. I think if I could speak freely as something of a Republican, but not as much card carrying anymore. I think the reason the folks who are Republicans signed letters saying that they supported the idea of a pause is they want to find out what the Chinese are up to. And if the Chinese say, no, we won't talk to you about a pause, they think that's worth finding out. I think the folks more left of center also share that view, but they harbor the belief, and I don't think unreasonably, in all fairness to them, that maybe the Chinese will see that it's imprudent to blow us off, and it might excite the neighbors too much, like the Japanese and South Koreans, and they might, who knows, say yes. In any case, that is quite a list. Ambassador Gallucci, Thomas Countryman is with us tonight, Bob Einhorn, Gary Seymour, Jessica Matthews from the Carter administration, Joe Nye from the Carter administration, Pickering. And then on the Republican side, Ambassador Bob Joseph, Christopher Ford is with us tonight, Will Toby, Henry Rowan, of course, unfortunately is dead, Lyndon Brooks, David Kay, Susan Cook, and then there are even a few congressmen who signed on to this idea. It's not a null set of people who think the answer is no. All right. Last question. We've answered. So now we go to 23. Well, what should be done? What are the action items here? Several. First, I think we need to have our diplomats go with others, for that matter, the other members of the 97 voluntary agreement, and ask China, why did you stop reporting after 2017 on your plutonium activities? When will you resume? I think in addition, I got the date wrong here, I'll fix it. We ought to ask them to do something I'm sure they're not going to agree to, but we should ask them. You say the United States has revealed in 2001 and 1996 exactly what its uranium and plutonium holdings were, both military and civil. Why don't you? I believe the British have done this, and I think everyone should. We have. Why aren't we asking them to do likewise? Now, they may say, go fly a kite, but you should ask. Also, I think we need to explore with them pausing civil reprocessing and commercial fast reactor development. And I think we should offer to do so ourselves. I see no reason why nuclear power is going to, leap forward because of some development with fast reactors. Thermal reactors, yes, but not fast reactors. It's at least a decade or more away. We do not need to do that on a crash basis, nor do the Chinese, nor do the Japanese, nor do the Koreans. And we know what will happen if they proceed forward. There's going to be a fizzle race. All right. Finally, we ought to determine if and how the U.S. could verify, actually there's two more, could verify if the PRC is not reprocessing U.S. origin spent fuel. We have an agreement with them that we struck in 2015 after they violated the 1985 agreement by using our civil reactor technology, canned coolant pumps on their naval reactors, which is a clear no-no. But we went ahead and said, all right, well, we'll let you, go ahead, because we thought we were going to sell them a lot of reactors. Well, we didn't. We sold 4. But do we know if they might cheat again and use spent fuel from those reactors, those American reactors, to make bombs? How would we verify? Does anybody have a narrative on how we would go about that? Also, how do we define even what a U.S. origin spent fuel is? We say it comes from U.S. origin reactors. There is no definition of what that is. The last thing I think you want to do is you want to go into closed session and ask the intelligence community, what is your methodology for making these forecasts? Why is it that the FAS has a number of 350 and SIPRI does as well? And Belfer, sort of is in the same zone, and you're in the low 200s. What are your assumptions? Are you assuming that they won't make any more material, that they're going to just use material they've stockpiled? How much do you think that material amounts to? Why do you think that? How do you know what they've made and they have hidden? Somebody should find out, even if it can't be made public. I think that's it, except to mention, let's go to slide 26. If you want to get very nervous about what the Chinese could do, there's plenty more they could. We did not talk about their heavy water reactors, which would, make at least enough right now for 150 bombs worth of plutonium a year. And it could be weapons grade. They're going to perhaps double that amount when they bring on 2 more of these reactors, in mid-century, 2025. We didn't discuss that. They also have massive amounts of enrichment capacity. All of these reactors can be used to make tritium. None of these reactors are under binding obligations to be inspected by international inspectors, for the simple reason that, they're a weapon state. Now, if you pressed on that, I think you'd probably have to open up some of your facilities for inspection. So I don't know how that works. But the bottom line is, this is a very conservative projection that we're making here. We're only focusing on the fast reactor part of it. With that, I conclude and open it for questions and comments. I'm going to depend on you, Bailey, to call out the questioners, because I can't see them.
There currently aren't any questions in the chat. Did anybody have any comments?
Oh, no, this can't be. That's ridiculous. No comments, no questions. Did I scare everyone off?
Go ahead, Mr. Babin. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, hey, Henry, I just had a quick question. So you point to the CANDUs as a potential source of plutonium, but has there been any modeling within the NGO community or among the expert community in terms of how much tritium they could extract from detritiating the water in the heavy reactors?
The short answer is, I don't know about the NGO community, but that's a known, there are models for that. And yeah, they could do that, but they can make tritium a lot of different ways without using heavy water reactors. But normally when you run these things, you do take the tritium out of the heavy water for occupational hazard reasons. And I would be astonished if they don't have a facility, certainly once they have 4 of these things running. And so that would be a source as well. But you can make tritium even in light water reactors. It's not. We do it, so I can't imagine it's that difficult to do. I don't think that's a limiting factor any more than highly enriched uranium would be. The plutonium is, I think, the pacing event.
I think that's Paul Bracken. I want to make sure I have the correct Paul. I know there's 2 Pauls on this call. So, Paul, go ahead.
Got it. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And this is just merely a suggestion. First of all, it's a really interesting briefing. And I've learned a lot, so thanks for that. But the suggestion is this: to separate the policy discussion into 2 parts. One is to look at forecasting, which is this right or is this wrong? Which would get into questions about how many nuclear weapons China could build over what time period. A altogether different framework to put on this is, suppose it's right, what are the consequences if it is? Okay, I used to work with Dan Bell at Harvard in the sociology department, and he always made this basic distinction in forecasting about, instead of looking at, is this true, is it likely, change the question to, suppose it is, what difference does it make? And it just opens up a lot of other questions.
It's an absolutely correct and important question, which I apologize I have not driven home. May I take a shot at a short answer?
Please.
I think depending how sophisticated and nuanced you are, which is, I say it with a certain amount of sarcasm, you can say, oh, well, numbers don't matter. We're only going to target some cities. We may never use these things. They have enough. They don't want to use many. I think the Chinese are pretty clear in stating that they don't want to make a whole lot more, although every once in a while you'll see someone in the South China Morning Post say, we need at least 1,000. I mean, so there's kind of a mixed signal there. But putting aside the question of who's right, who's wrong, on whether numbers matter, I think people who have election certificates in this country, at least, actually are share the view of Joseph Stalin, who said quantity has a quality all of its own. And when you get to numbers that are equal, it causes at least a political reaction, is my hunch. And it will probably divert and draw tremendous attention to doing something in the nuclear area that you might not otherwise consider doing. So if you're an arms control advocate, this is not good. It also means that the prospects of ever getting them in the tent to come down is going to be a lot harder. If you're like somebody who is interested in nuclear weapons, the question then becomes, okay, if you've got a problem of parity with China and they're friendly with the Russians, how much is enough? Boy, does that become a really difficult question to answer. Once you go down this path, you then have to worry, is this going to distract us from investing in other things we need to invest in for our security? So it's not great news if they come up. You really would prefer them not to. And one other thing, I don't see how they can come up and us have more traction in keeping South Korea and Japan from going nuclear. I think it becomes much tougher. And if even one of those goes in that direction, Katie barred the door. I mean, I went and visited, my wife's Australian. We went and visited the beautiful bay where they were going to make a nuclear power facility to make bombs. They didn't. But believe me, I mean, Australia is capable of doing that. They made centrifuges instead, and they made them in 36 months, and they worked. These are not people slow of foot when it comes to this stuff. Where does it end? I have no idea. Do you want to open that box? Letting this grow makes it more likely you have all of these headaches. Not saying anything, maybe downplaying the possibility that you're too low, not talking to the Chinese, not having a public narrative about this. I think a big mistake. Now, that wasn't a brief answer, but how did that work for you?
Okay, that's fine, and I may have views on things you said, and agree, disagree. I just want to go back to the basic methodological distinction between treating this as an estimate and is it right? How many does it, weapons could they build? And an altogether different question, if they were to go down this road and we were surprised by 1,000 to 2,000 more Chinese nuclear warheads, what are the consequences? And you were dealing with that. So I just want to make a basic methodological point and not assert arguments about what it does mean in fact. I
would second that, and I hope people would like to join on the 3 points I made, because I actually think those are the 3 points we need to think about.
Well, let me say, my takeaway on trying to calculate the number of warheads they could acquire by 2030 is that there's so much uncertainty. It could be anything you want to pick. We did the calculation to sort of look at really the lower limit of what if they chose to pursue increasing the number of thermonuclear warheads on ICBMs. We picked a number that's sort of easy for them to get to. They could get bigger numbers, but this is the very conservative estimate. And all the calculations we did just again and again point out how little we know about what's going on. I mean, we don't know whether they have underground production sites. Probably don't, but they could. It's just uncertainty after uncertainty mounts up in these calculations, and it points to at least what, as Henry said, we ought to at least ask them the questions. They may not answer them, but
well, and I think there's an advantage in getting rebuffed. People say, "Oh, but that won't work," and the returner is, "Well, what do you mean by work?" We would at least find out whether they want to be open about this. And if they don't, that tells us something. I mean, it's not a great look that they suspended their voluntary reporting. They agreed to that. No one forced them to do that. They agreed to do that. That they chose not to do that is, something of some moment. We should find out why. I mean, how, and if we may not find out, but
Yes.
Yeah.
Henry, you're in the
Yeah, I thought I'd try.
Dr. Ford, you were up next in the chat.
Chris?
Okay, hopefully you can hear me.
We can hear you.
I just had a question actually about timing. Certainly it's not your report does not allege that the inevitable destination here is the diversion of all this material for weapons purposes.
Certainly don't.
It's alarming enough for this to be a sort of possibility, I suppose. But I guess my question went more to timing. Were there to be some kind of a decision to divert this emergent plutonium production infrastructure to weapons purposes? That's not, of course, the only, having material is not the only thing involved in producing a weapon. You've got to actually do the building. And, for a country that has a, single point of bottleneck in its own production infrastructure at Pantex, the natural question from my perspective is like, okay, let's assume they did this. How fast would it be to actually turn them into weapons? Do we have anything in the open source world on guesstimates about their weapons assembly throughput? I noticed that there have been some press reports that they've been building a bigger footprint.
I'll
What does that
defer
mean?
to Tom, but let me turn that timing question into something more interesting. The short answer is don't know, probably not. I wouldn't assume that it's his bottleneck, but it might be. And boy, would that be classified embarrassment only, you know? But there is another timing point. Why bring this up now, I think, is first of all, we just found out about these two reprocessing plants. So I should say the second one just recently, and the second fast reactor just recently. And so I think a lot of people in the so-called non-proliferation community were a little caught out on those announcements. That's number one. Number two, right now in Korea, there is a president that doesn't really favor going ahead with at least the pyro program, which is necessary to move ahead with their fast reactor program. And in Japan, they are having a heck of a time getting Rikasho started and won't before 2023. I think if you're going to talk about the plausibility of taking a pause, you also have to think that the United States has got eyes for fast reactor commercial development that are far bigger than their stomach right now. Item, the versatile test reactor, which seems to be essential for making fast reactors commercial development move, did not get funded very much. They wanted an order of magnitude more money than they got. I think they got 45 million. Now is the time to talk about this. You wait a little bit longer, like another year or two, everyone say, well, it's too late. Too late. It's not too late now. Let's give it an honest shot. It's okay to fail.
Chris, I would think that the fabrication of the warheads would be a lot easier than getting the plutonium, and therefore is not going to be as constrained in terms of the numbers. If the issue really is, do they have a program now in which they are planning to use, or at least available to use, the plutonium from these fast reactors for weapons? And if that's the plan, I'm sure they have a plan. Part of that plan would be to have adequate warhead fabrication capacity, which they could build far more quickly than they can build these reactors and reprocessing plants.
What is interesting is this story seems to have gotten so much more coverage overseas than in this country. I find that, a bit odd. I don't really have an explanation for that one, but there it is. Yes. It seems like we may be distracted from first points here, and I have to say that that hearing was very helpful. Asking that question, it was extremely helpful that Senator Rounds asked that question. Be useful to see who else is interested in pursuing that. Right.
Back in the 1950s, the U.S. was doubling the production, the fabrication of warheads, roughly every 2 years.
I might only additionally add that if you look, the State Department just put out a broad area announcement. They want to figure out what we can do to talk more to the Chinese and what about. Well, here you go. Here's something you can talk to them about. I think the U.S. is struggling to figure out how to make connection with the Chinese. I think they might actually take seriously discussion on this, particularly if we're serious enough to say, this is worth everybody pausing on, not just you. I think that's a concession to my woolly headedness, but I think it's useful to let yourself think about that. and think positively as well as worry about the negative possibilities. I mean, the Chinese certainly, have got to wonder if they start with raising concerns about these warheads, what their neighbors might do, how the Indians and Russians and the Americans will react. You really don't want them to, and the best way not to make them react is not to go down this road in the first place. Anyway, I'm now pleading, which is a bad look, so I'll stop. There was a question from Don. Don?
I wanted to know if you knew, or perhaps anybody else, whether Senator Rounds ever got any follow-on information, if he's followed up, if anybody else has followed up, if there have been similar questions asked.
Frank Tedeschi is the expert since he works for Senator Rounds. I don't know if he feels comfortable answering, but we surely should ask him to see if he is. Frank?
He's following up, hasn't gotten a response yet, but it's not for lack of trying to get the right parties together. It's just the coordination. Haven't gotten an answer yet.
Well, it sounds like if I read between the tea leaves, you just found another person interested.
Yeah, mild interest. Yes.
There you go. Well, we'll take it any way we can get it. I don't understand. Given the almost fanatical partisanship, why this one can't be embraced for different reasons by both sides of the aisle. I mean, there's something here for everyone. No matter what your outlook. This is not really an axe grind on anything in particular. It's kind of like good government, I think. I don't know, whatever that might be, huh? Right. So, any more questions? I don't want to drag this out, but I do enjoy talking about this. I should mention again that none of this work would have picked up a head of steam had it not been for a lot of work that went on at Belfer by Wei Zhang, whose I think analysis is certainly the most detailed you can find anywhere, and I think the panels and everybody. Essentially, international panels depend very heavily on his analysis. Yes. And now, Brandon had a question. Again, Mr. Babin, has anyone unearthed any research tying any of these facilities to China's military civil fusion campaign? I would probably turn to Chris. I mean, there was an awful lot of discussion in the Trump administration about civil military fusion. Was nuclear one of the concerns? And if so, why?
Sorry, struggling with my mute button there for a second. I don't myself remember. There may be people on this circuit who have more detail to hand. I don't remember anything specifically about these plants.
No, but nuclear generally, civil.
But in general, there was explicit concern about which we pointed to a number of times, about some of the major players in the Chinese civil nuclear sector being lashed up with the PLA for things like naval propulsion, aircraft carriers that would threaten China's neighbors, attack submarines, ballistic missile submarine propulsion, things of that nature, and the degree to which not only were they working with the PLA Navy to do those things, but some worries about whether foreign acquired technology could be diverted for those purposes too. What I don't remember is seeing anything specifically about weapons qua weapons, as in nuclear ones, but certainly in terms of the civil nuclear sector, they would appear to be very close indeed to the plan. Over.
Yeah, the irony, if there is any, is the regs that came out, I want to say, was it October of 2018 or 17? I forget which, that made it very difficult to transfer nuclear civil technology to China that was quote unquote advanced, immediately caught Bill Gates's fast reactor program. And I don't think he was very happy about that. But it appears as though that just got caught, not necessarily because there was a preoccupation with worrying about the production of weapons grade plutonium. But in fact, that did get caught up in that, and he had to pull out.
Yeah, I think the rationale there, Henry, was that things for which the horse had already left the barn, the new regs didn't really get in the way of continued engagement on stuff that had already been transferred, but the things that the Chinese did not already have were going to be, shifted to a presumption of denial, and that included the Gates thing, but not necessarily specifically for the plutonium reason, just because it was new and stuff that we didn't feel that they particularly needed to be getting good at one way or the other.
Well, again, this may suggest that Admiral Richard was telling the truth when he said, we only began to look at this connection, a week ago. The reason I find that a little disturbing is I know for a fact that several pretty important analytic groups in the Pentagon were briefed on some of these connections easily 4 years ago. And so I think, I guess we're waiting, for something to land in our front yard before we start, thinking about how to think about these things. But I think we have reason here to at least sharpen our pencils more. And someone I hope who's listening in the congressional aid arena would try to get the intelligence community or the armed services community to put in closed session some of these questions to these folks, so you could at least know what the methodology was and convince yourself that it made sense, and that what the uncertainties were and what they think they were, and why they say what they say. I think you need to press harder on this, because I do think, for all the reasons I laid out in answering Paul Bracken, it actually does matter a lot if they do go ahead and do this, and you don't want them to. And if they had their wits about them, I think they wouldn't want to do it if they thought it all the way through. But I don't think they may have. I think that's the reason we want to talk to them. Okay, well, let's see here. I don't think we want to kick a dead horse. It is now 6:25. I see no comments in the chat room. You folks have been incredibly patient with a very awkward beginning, which I apologize for. I don't know what the heck was going on there, but thankfully it's not a problem now. My hunch is it has more to do with Delaware wireless service than it does anything as conspiratorial as foreign countries. So on that note, I want to thank you all for coming. And if any of you want to hang back and ask a private question, I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, I bid you good night and thank you again for coming.